The morning the Duke of Ashford left his bride at Windermere Hall, there were no flowers on the table, no fire in the grate, and no one left in the house who cared whether she lived or died. He had married her on a Tuesday, quietly, without flowers, without guests who mattered, without the warmth of a single word that resembled tenderness. She was the daughter of a bankrupt viscount, chosen not for beauty or charm or wit, but because her dying father had held a document that could ruin the Ashford name. And marrying her had been the cleanest solution to a complicated problem. The Duke had looked at her across the altar of a cold country church, seen her thin shoulders and her pale, faintly hollow face, the slight tremor in her hands that she fought so visibly to control. And he had made a private judgment. She would not last the year. She was too frail for this world, too fragile for his world in particular, and whatever obligation the marriage created, it would resolve itself naturally, without further inconvenience to him. So he had left her 3 trunks, 1 maid who left within a fortnight, a household account with barely enough to keep candles lit, and 47 rooms of decaying silence. What he did not know, what he could not have known, because he had not bothered to look, was what she would do with that silence, what Cecily Holt would build inside it, what she would become, and what it would cost him the day he came back and found it. Cecily had known, from the moment she signed the marriage documents, that this was not a love match. She had known it the way one knows the approach of winter, not as a surprise, but as an inevitability one must simply prepare for. Her father had explained the arrangement with the careful, shameful honesty of a man who had nothing left to offer except the truth. The Duke of Ashford required the deed of settlement her father held. The deed, transferred through marriage, would protect the Ashford estate from a legal claim that had been quietly festering for 11 years. In exchange, Cecily would receive a title, a roof, and whatever years of respectable obscurity she might manage to sustain. She had agreed. She had no other choice that did not involve a governess post or a relations charity. And she had seen enough of charity to know it came with invisible debts that lasted longer than any formal contract. The wedding was held on the 14th of November in the village church at Ashford's country estate in Somerset. The Duke arrived precisely on time, wearing an expression of composed, almost sculptural neutrality. He was taller than she had expected, broad-shouldered, with dark hair going silver at the temples and eyes the color of a winter's sea, gray, deep, and carrying within them a quality she could not immediately name. It was not cruelty, exactly. It was something more like absence, as though whatever warmth a man might ordinarily hold behind his eyes had been carefully removed and stored elsewhere, somewhere she would never be invited. He did not take her hands during the ceremony. He stood beside her, said the words required of him with precise and entirely hollow diction, and when the vicar pronounced them wed, he turned to her with a small, formal nod that communicated everything about the nature of their arrangement in a single motion. There was no wedding breakfast. A brief carriage ride conveyed them to Windermere Hall, which sat 6 miles from the village on a hill that in better seasons was probably picturesque, but in November presented itself as a gray and windswept reproach to human ambition. The hall itself was large, imposing in the way of houses that had been grand a generation ago and had since been allowed to deteriorate through a combination of inattention and pride. Gutters drooped. A shutter on the east wing hung at a sad angle. The gravel of the drive was patchy and overgrown at its edges. Inside, she met Mrs. Dallow, the housekeeper, a woman of 60 with a face like closed shutters, who showed her to a bedroom that smelled of damp and disuse, and explained that the household staff currently consisted of herself, a kitchen girl named Polly, and a groundsman of advanced age called Bert who managed the horses and the worst of the outdoor neglect. The Duke followed Cecily into the sitting room adjacent to her bedroom, stood by the window, and spoke to her directly for the first time since the church. "The account at Marsden's bank has been arranged," he said. "It will cover basic household necessities. I shall be returning to London within the hour. My solicitor, Mr. Hale, will correspond with you should any material matter arise. I trust you will manage." She looked at him steadily. "And if I do not manage?" Something moved in his gray eyes. It was not quite guilt, and it was not quite acknowledgement. It was closer to the expression of a man who has decided not to ask a question because he does not wish to hear the answer. "I trust that you will," he repeated. And then he was gone. The first week was the worst. Not because of the cold, though the cold was genuine and penetrating, pressing through the walls of Windmere Hall as though the house itself had given up the effort of warmth. Not even because of the loneliness, though that was a presence as tangible as weather. It was worse because of the cough. Cecily had been managing it for 2 years, a dry, persistent thing that lived in her chest and emerged most aggressively in cold weather. The remnant of a winter fever that had frightened her father's physician considerably more than it had frightened her. She had learned to breathe around it, to rest strategically, to avoid damp and overexertion, to eat what she could manage and sleep when her body demanded it. She knew the limits of her body the way a sailor knows the limits of a vessel, not with resignation, but with precise and practical respect. On the third morning at Windmere Hall, she took stock. She sat at the small writing desk in her bedroom with a candle, a sheet of paper, and the household account book she found in the desk drawer, and she wrote down everything she knew. The money in the account, the number of rooms, the names of the 3 people in the house, the state of the kitchen garden, which she had inspected briefly through the window and found to be in the kind of disorder that suggested years of disregard. The firewood situation, which was inadequate. The larder, which was sparse but not entirely hopeless. Then she wrote down what she needed, what she could fix herself, what she could not fix alone, what she could teach Polly to do, what she could convince Mrs. Dallow to do, which she suspected would require more careful management than the gardens. Mrs. Dallow had been at Windmere Hall for 31 years. She had served the previous Duke and his wife, and she had watched the house empty out around her with the slow, dignified grief of someone who has outlasted the world they were made for. She was not cruel to Cecily. She was simply certain that nothing would change, and that certainty had calcified into something close to indifference. Cecily approached her in the kitchen on the 4th morning, asked for tea, and sat down at the kitchen table. Mrs. Dallow looked at her as though she had done something unusual. "I am going to need your help," Cecily said, without preamble. "Not as your employer, exactly, though I suppose I am that as well. As someone who does not yet know this house and needs to learn it quickly. Will you teach me?" There was a long pause. "You are not what I expected," Mrs. Dallow said at last. "No," Cecily agreed. "I suspect that is to our advantage." It was not an instant transformation. Nothing about the coming months was instant. But it was a beginning. And beginnings, Cecily had learned, were everything. She started with the kitchen garden, because the kitchen garden was the foundation. Polly, who was 17 and possessed of more practical energy than she had been given credit for, proved willing and surprisingly knowledgeable about soil and seeds. Together, on the better days, they cleared the worst of the dead growth, turned the earth in the beds that could be saved, and planted the winter vegetables that might yield something before the hardest cold arrived. On the days Cecily's chest would not permit outdoor work, she studied the household ledgers, learning the patterns of expenditure and income from previous years, identifying where money had hemorrhaged silently from the estate through inattention and poor contracts. She wrote 3 careful letters, one to the Duke's solicitor regarding a timber contract that had been underpriced for a decade, one to a local farmer regarding grazing rights that the hall held but had never exercised, and one to a woman in the village recommended by Bert as a skilled daily help who might be engaged for modest wages. Mr. Hale, the solicitor, did not reply to her first letter. He replied to her second, briefly, with the tone of a man who was mildly surprised to find himself corresponding with a woman on matters of estate management. He was more forthcoming with her third letter, and by the 4th, something approaching professional respect had entered his phrasing. The winter came down hard in January. A storm tore the loose shutter from the east wing entirely, and the east passage flooded badly enough to damage the flooring. Cecily organized the response herself: buckets, towels, a careful survey of the affected rooms, a letter to a local carpenter detailing the repairs needed and requesting an estimate that was reasonable rather than merely convenient. She was managing, not comfortably, not without cost. On the hard days, when the cough was bad and the cold was relentless and the silence of the house pressed on her like something physical, she allowed herself 1 hour of something close to despair, and then she rose, drank the herbal preparation Bert's wife had recommended, wrapped herself in the heaviest shawl she owned, and went back to work. She was not waiting for rescue. She had never expected rescue. She was building something, one careful day at a time, in the house where she had been left to disappear. By March, Wyndmere Hall had begun, quietly and almost reluctantly, to come back to life. The kitchen garden yielded its first real harvest, modest but genuine. Mrs. Dallow, whose initial resistance had softened by degrees into a kind of guarded collaboration, had produced from some deep recess of the hall's larder a collection of seed packets that had belonged to the previous duchess, and these, supplemented by what Cecily had purchased with careful economy, now occupied 3 full beds along the south-facing wall. The daily help Cecily had engaged, a woman named Agnes, solid and good-natured and wonderfully skilled with a mop and a will, had made inroads on the worst of the accumulated grime. Rooms were aired, windows were cleaned. The great dining room, which had felt like a cave, now admitted light from its tall Georgian windows, and one could sit in it without the oppressive sense of dust and time. There was something else, too, something Cecily had not anticipated. In February, a child had arrived at the kitchen door. He was perhaps 8 years old, thin and hollow-eyed and dressed in clothes that had been patched so many times they were more patched than original garment. His name, it emerged through patient questioning, was William, and he was the son of a farm worker on a nearby property who had died of fever in January. The family he had been sent to, a cousin in the village, had found themselves unable to absorb another mouth. Cecily had looked at him standing at her kitchen door in the cold, and she had thought, with absolute clarity, I know exactly what this feels like. She had installed him in the small bedroom at the end of the servants' corridor, fed him a proper meal, and written a letter to the local parish about formalizing some arrangement. But the letter had somehow remained unsent. Because in the meantime William had begun to make himself quietly useful in the way of children who have learned early that usefulness is the safest currency. Fetching wood, running messages, following Bird around the stables with an expression of concentrated devotion that the old man clearly found both alarming and gratifying. By April, there were 2 more children. Both girls, sisters, 7 and 9, daughters of a woman in the village who had fallen gravely ill and had no family nearby to take them. Mrs. Dallow, who had pronounced herself violently opposed to the presence of children in the house, had within 3 weeks of their arrival begun baking extra bread and teaching the elder one to hem linen with the focused authority of a woman who had been waiting years for someone to instruct. The hall was not grand. It was far from restored. But it was warm, and it was alive, and on the evenings when Cecily sat in the small parlor, she had made habitable. Firelight, mended curtains, a pot of herbs on the windowsill. William doing his letters at the table while the girls slept. She felt something she had not expected to feel in this place. She felt at home. She was writing in the estate ledger one afternoon in late April when Bert appeared at the parlor door with an expression she had not seen on his weathered face before. Something between wariness and reluctant warning. A rider came, Bert said, from London. Says His Grace is returning to Wyndmere Hall. Cecily put down her pen. She looked at the room around her, the mended curtains, the herbs, the children's drawings that William had pinned carefully to the wall beside the fireplace. The ledgers stacked neatly on the side table, and she felt something complex and careful arrange itself within her chest. When? She asked. End of the week, said Bert. She nodded once, picked up her pen, and returned to the ledger. He arrived on a Thursday evening, when the light was going gold over the Somerset hills and the kitchen smelled of bread and wood smoke. The Duke of Ashford had been in Somerset once in the past 7 months, a single overnight stop on his way between London and a political engagement in Bath, during which he had not entered Wyndmere Hall at all, but had spent the night at the Ashford Arms in the village and departed before sunrise. He had told himself this was practical. He had almost believed it. He had thought about her, occasionally, in the way one thinks of a door left unlocked, with a low, persistent unease that one resolves not to examine too closely. His solicitor's communications had grown increasingly puzzling. References to a renegotiated timber contract. A letter about grazing fees now being collected rather than merely owed. A note that the East Wing passage had been repaired and the account updated accordingly. He had read each of these communications with a growing sense that something was not proceeding as he had imagined it would. He had imagined a woman quietly fading, a house quietly decaying, a situation requiring very little of him except the occasional influx of funds. What he found, as his carriage came up the drive in the amber evening light, was that the gravel had been raked. The hanging shutter was gone, replaced by one that was plain but properly hung and painted. The front steps had been scrubbed. There were herbs growing in pots on either side of the front door and in the window of the parlor, a room he had always associated with dusty disuse. There was a light, warm and steady. He stood at the foot of the steps for a moment before going in. Mrs. Dallow opened the door to him, and something in her expression, a quality of careful watchfulness replacing what had previously been simple resignation, gave him his second pause. "Your Grace," she said, "welcome back to Manor Hall." He stepped into the entrance hall and stopped. It was the same house. The architecture had not changed, the bones of it were exactly as he had left them. But the quality of the air was different. Something had been released here. Some long-held breath of cold and neglect had been replaced by warmth. By the smell of beeswax on the wooden floor and bread from somewhere toward the back of the house, by the faint sound of a child's voice asking a question he could not make out from here. He turned to Mrs. Dallow. "Is there a child in this house?" "3 children, Your Grace," she said, with the expression of a woman who has made her peace with a situation and will not be reopening negotiations. "3," he stopped. "Where is the Duchess?" "In the library, I believe. She is reviewing the spring accounts." He found her at the library table. It was a room he had not set foot in for years, had barely thought of since inheriting the house from his father. The shelves were dusty, the books disordered, but the table itself was cleared and organized, and she sat behind it in the lamplight with ledger books open before her and a pen in her hand, and an expression of such complete absorption that she did not immediately look up when he entered. When she did look up, he was struck by something he had not prepared for. She was not the same woman he had left here in November. Or rather, she was exactly the same woman, and he was only now, for the first time, actually seeing her. She was still pale, still fine-boned, still carrying in the lines of her face and the careful way she held herself the suggestion of a body that was managed rather than merely inhabited. But there was no fragility in her eyes. There was steadiness, composure, and something else, a guardedness that he recognized, with a sharp and uncomfortable clarity, as the direct result of what he had done. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was even. Her eyes did not drop. "Duchess," he replied. A pause. "I was not expecting you until the end of the week," she said. "I made better time than anticipated." "I see." She closed the ledger. She did not rise, which surprised him, and then surprised him further that it surprised him. "I have asked Mrs. Dallow to prepare the Duke's rooms. Agnes will have them ready within the hour. In the meantime, there is supper if you wish it, or I can have a tray sent to the sitting room." She spoke like a woman who had been managing a house, this house, for months, because he had left her here with nothing, and she had turned nothing into this. "I would prefer," he said slowly, "to take supper in the dining room." The ghost of something crossed her face, not surprise, exactly. Something more careful than that. "Very well," she said. "I will have it arranged." She rose then, gathered the ledgers with practiced efficiency, and moved past him toward the door. She did not brush against him. She maintained, with absolute precision, a distance of exactly as much space as the room permitted. He turned to watch her go. He stood alone in the library for a long moment, in the warm lamplight of a room she had clearly been using as her own, surrounded by evidence of a life she had built here entirely without him. And for the first time since November, the Duke of Ashford felt like a stranger in his own house. The first week of his return was a careful, polite, and almost unbearable exercise in mutual wariness. He was at breakfast when she was not. She was in the garden when he walked the grounds. Their conversations at dinner were measured and civil and entirely superficial, conducted across the length of the long dining room table with the careful neutrality of 2 diplomats from nations that had not yet decided whether to be at war. He observed, because he could not help observing. He watched the children appear at meals. William, grave and watchful, studying the Duke with the assessing eyes of a child who had learned to read adults for warning signs. The 2 girls, Clara and Josephine, who were considerably less restrained and regarded him with the frank, unsettling curiosity of the very young. He watched Cecily with them. The quiet authority she carried in her interactions, the way she managed each child as a distinct individual rather than a collective inconvenience. The way she corrected and guided and encouraged without ever raising her voice. He watched Mrs. Dallow defer to her on matters of household management with a respect that had clearly been earned over months of patient negotiation. And he watched old Bert touch his hat to her with a warmth that was entirely genuine. On the fourth day, he asked her directly about the children. They were walking the kitchen garden, his suggestion, which had surprised her, and she was showing him the progress of the spring planting with the careful, contained pride of someone who will not allow themselves to be seen as seeking approval. The children, he said. You took them in. They required a home, she said. This house has rooms. It also has costs. Modest ones, in this case. William works for what he receives, and I am in correspondence with the parish about a formal arrangement. Clara and Josephine's mother is recovering and expects to be well enough to have them returned to her by midsummer. She paused, looked at a row of seedlings with precision. If that concerns you, I am prepared to defend each decision on its merits. I was not criticizing, he said. She glanced at him, just briefly, just long enough for him to see that she did not entirely believe him, and that she was reserving judgment on that particular matter. The timber contract, he said. Hale wrote to me about it. You renegotiated it. The previous rate was set in 1809 and had not been reviewed since. The market value had increased considerably. Where did you learn to negotiate contracts? A pause. I read, she said. He had no response to that which did not sound inadequate, so he said nothing. That evening, a letter arrived from the neighboring estate. Moorcote Park, the property of one Sir Edmund Grey, a man of middle age and considerable local influence, and a manor that, in the Duke's experience, existed somewhere between obsequious and threatening, depending on which was more useful to him at any given moment. The letter was addressed to the Duke, but its subject was Cecily. Sir Edmund wrote to express, with elaborate courtesy, his concern that the Duchess of Ashford had, during the Duke's absence, overstepped with regard to a right-of-way across the northern boundary of the Windermere estate. He claimed that she had redirected traffic through a gate that Moorcote Park had traditionally used, inconveniencing his tenants and costing him time and money. The Duke read the letter twice. Then he went to find Cecily. She was in the small parlor, reading to Clara and Josephine by the fire. He waited in the doorway until she looked up, then gestured briefly toward the hall. She set the book down, told the girls she would return in a moment, and came to him with the expression of a woman who has been expecting something unpleasant and has prepared herself for it. He showed her the letter. She read it standing in the hallway, without any change of expression whatsoever. Then she said, The gate he refers to crosses land that belongs to Windermere Hall by documented deed. Moorcote Park has no formal right-of-way. They have been using it by habit, because no one here was present to object. I have the deed in the library. Did you consult a solicitor before redirecting the traffic? I wrote to Mr. Hale. He confirmed my interpretation. She met his eyes. What Sir Edmund is suggesting is not a legal dispute. It is an attempt to intimidate me through you. I suspected, when I took the action, that he might do exactly this. I should have warned you to expect it. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. You should have, he agreed. There was a charge in the air between them. Not quite anger, not quite respect, but something made of both. Write to Sir Edmund, he said at last. I will countersign the letter. The right-of-way claim is without merit, and I will say so in terms he will not find easy to misinterpret. Something shifted in her face. Very slightly, very carefully, but he saw it. Thank you, she said, with the restraint of a woman who has learned not to invest too much in a single gesture of decency. He almost said something more. Instead, he nodded, once, and returned to his study. He found the cough in the rain. It had been a wet May, and on the evening of a particularly heavy downpour, he had gone to close the shutters in the eastern passage when he heard it from the room at the far end, her room. Or what had become her room since the suite originally assigned to her was too cold and too distant from the fire to be practical in winter. A cough, long, dry, effortful, followed by silence, and then the sound of her moving, carefully, and the soft sound of a drawer opening. He stood in the passage and listened to her manage it, the pauses, the deliberate breathing, the sound of a glass being filled from the pitcher on the nightstand. He returned to his own rooms. He did not sleep well. In the morning, he came to the breakfast table early, and when she arrived and sat across from him, he said, without preamble, because he had learned that she responded better to directness than to elaborate approach, "Your cough. How long has it been persistent?" She looked at him. Then she poured her tea with complete steadiness. 2 years, approximately. Has a physician examined you? 3 of them. They disagreed somewhat on the particulars, but concurred that it is manageable with care, not progressive in the way the most alarming possibilities would suggest, and not a death sentence. Despite what my father clearly led you to believe. The silence between them had texture. Your father told me, he began, that I was sickly and likely to die within the year, she said, with the calm of someone who has spent considerable time making peace with a painful truth. Yes, he was frightened and desperate, and he said what was necessary to make you feel the transaction was low risk. I did not know he had told you that until some weeks after the wedding. She looked at him steadily. It was wrong of him. I am not going to apologize for it, as I did not instruct him to say it. But I understand that it formed your impression of me. He said nothing. He was not, he realized, sure what he wanted to say, only that something inside him had been shifting steadily. Since the moment he walked through the door of Manor Hall and found it breathing. You built all of this, he said quietly, knowing I had left because I expected you to die. I built it because I intended to live, she said, and because the house needed it. And because, she paused, looked at her tea, because I have never in my life been offered an empty space before. I have always been given someone else's definition of what I was and what I could do. Here, for the first time, there was no one to tell me otherwise. She looked up at him. I found I did not waste it. He thought of his own silence, his own absences, his own carefully maintained armor of duty and distance. The things he had told himself were necessary because the alternative was to feel, and to feel was to be vulnerable. And to be vulnerable was to be his father, who had loved extravagantly and lost everything and died grief-shattered when the estate collapsed under his debts. He had built his own empty spaces, the Duke realized. He had just chosen to live inside them. That evening, after dinner, he told her about the war. Not at length, not dramatically. He was not built for dramatic confession. But they were in the parlor, and the children were in bed, and the fire was low and comfortable, and he had found himself speaking before he had quite decided to. The siege of Badajoz. The 6 months he had spent afterward in a house in London, not sleeping, not eating enough, unable to account for the hours that passed around him like water. The way he had learned to seal it all off, to functionally exist behind a pane of glass through which everything reached him slightly muted, slightly safe. He had never spoken of it to anyone. He did not entirely understand why he was speaking of it now, to her, in the lamplight of the home she had made. She did not say she was sorry, which he would have found difficult to receive. She did not offer pity, which would have been worse. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That sounds like a very long time to carry something alone." It was, he thought. It had been. The letter came in June, and it came with the weight of a summons. The Lord Chamberlain's office, requesting the Duke of Ashford's presence in London not later than the 20th for a matter of considerable political delicacy. A committee appointment. A seat of real influence, the kind of public role the Duke had spent 15 years making himself indispensable enough to receive. It was what he had worked for, maneuvered for, kept himself cold and controlled and available for. He read it at the desk in his study, and he sat with it for a long time. On the same evening, Bert's youngest grandson appeared at the kitchen door, barely coherent with fear, to report that William had gone out to the farm meadow to check on a ewe that had been ailing, had not returned by dark, and was now somewhere on the far edge of the estate in a rainstorm that had descended with sudden, violent conviction. What followed was not the romantic drama of novels. It was wet and alarming and deeply practical. The Duke went out with Bert and 2 lanterns and a rope. Cecily, whom no one had thought to exclude, and who had appeared in the kitchen in her heaviest cloak before anyone had made an active decision about her presence, came with them. She knew the estate now in ways he did not, knew the paths, the gullies, the places where water collected dangerously in heavy rain. She found the boy. He had slipped into a drainage ditch at the meadow's edge, not deeply, not catastrophically, but deeply enough to be frightened and cold and unable to pull himself out unaided. She heard him before the lanterns reached him, followed the sound with the certainty of someone who had spent 6 months learning to listen to this land, and was already sliding carefully down the muddy bank when the Duke came up behind her. He reached past her and pulled the boy out with a single, decisive movement, and then held him, this thin, frightened child who was not his, who had appeared at a kitchen door and been given a home by his wife, and felt something break open in his chest that he had not known was sealed. Back at the house, William was dried and warmed and scolded gently and put to bed. Cecily managed everything with quiet efficiency, and then she sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and the expression of someone who has just allowed themselves to feel the thing they did not feel during the emergency. He sat across from her. "The letter from London," she said, without looking up. "I heard Mrs. Dallow mention it." "Yes. You should go," she said. "If it is what you have worked toward, you should take it." He was quiet. "I thought," he said slowly, "that you might be relieved if I went." She looked up. "I thought so too," she said. "At first, when you arrived in April, I thought, he will see that things are managed, that he is not needed, and he will leave again. And I was prepared for that. I had been prepared for that since November. And now," she met his eyes, and in hers he saw the thing she would not say, would not allow herself to say, because she was a woman who had learned that hope was a thing to be defended, not offered freely. "I think," she said, carefully, "that you should decide what it is you actually want. Not what your position requires. Not what your father's debts and your own grief have led you to pursue as a substitute for living. What you want." The words landed like something real and heavy. "I have been managing estates and committees and positions of influence," he said, "for 15 years. I have been very good at all of it." "Yes," she said. "And I have been entirely alone for all of it." "Yes," she said, again more quietly. He wrote to the Lord Chamberlain's office the next morning. The letter declined the appointment with courtesy and sufficient explanation to avoid political offense, and cited obligations of estate management and family that required his presence in Somerset. He sealed it, gave it to the writer, and did not allow himself to reconsider it once it had left his hand. He found Cecily in the garden. She was cutting lavender with Josephine, who was chattering about something involving a robin and a disputed nest, and she looked up when he came through the gate with an expression of cautious attention, the expression she still wore when he appeared unexpectedly, the expression that reminded him, precisely and uncomfortably, that he had not yet fully earned the right to her ease. He waited until Josephine had been sent inside with her armful of lavender, and then he stood with her in the June morning, with the smell of lavender and warm earth around them. And he said what he should have said months ago, or should have thought to feel before November, or perhaps had simply never in his life been capable of saying until a woman had shown him what it looked like to build a home out of nothing. "I made a judgment about you," he said, "before I knew anything about you. I decided you were fragile and temporary and not worth the effort of knowing. I left you here because I expected you to fail or fade or both, and I did not examine my reasons, because examining them would have required a kind of honesty I was not, at that time, willing to manage." He paused. She watched him with the stillness of someone who will not make it easier for you to say a difficult thing and does not feel obligated to. "I was wrong," he said, "in every particular. You are not any of the things I decided you were. You are the most capable, the most quietly courageous, the most genuinely good person I have encountered in a life that has included a great many people who performed both virtues with considerable less authenticity." He held her gaze. "I do not ask you to forgive me quickly, because I have given you no reason to trust quickly, but I am hoping, for the chance to remain here, to know you, to build whatever this house is becoming, alongside you, as I should have been doing from the beginning." Cecily was quiet. She looked at the garden around her, the beds she had turned, the herbs she had planted, the paths she had cleared, the small bright flag of life she had built out of 47 rooms of silence. "You left," she said, "because you thought I was not worth staying for." "Yes. And you are asking to stay now because you have seen what I built." "No," he said. "I am asking to stay because I have seen who you are. The house is extraordinary. You are more so. And I have wasted too much of my life in empty rooms of my own making, and I find I do not want to waste the rest." She looked at him for a long time. Not with anger, not with the cold politeness of the dinner table, not with the careful distance she had maintained since his return, just with the steadiness that was, he had come to understand, her truest quality, a steadiness built not from ease but from everything she had endured and not allowed to break her. "The children will not be sent away," she said. "No," he said, "they will not. And if I decide that something requires changing in how this estate is managed, I will come to you as a partner in that conversation, not as someone requesting permission." "That is as it should be," he said. Another pause. Something shifted in her face. The last careful guard, not abandoned but perhaps, for the first time, held a little loosely. "Then," she said, "I think you may stay, Your Grace." "Alistair," he said. She looked at him. "My name," he said. "I would like, if you are willing, for you to use it." She considered this with the solemnity it deserved. "Alistair," she said, and her voice, when she said it, held something that was not yet love. Love was still months away, still to be built slowly and honestly through shared mornings and quiet evenings and the thousand small acts of choosing each other, but was the beginning of it, warm and real and entirely genuine. "The lavender needs to be bundled before it dries. Will you help me?" He had not bundled lavender in his life. He said so. "Then it is time you learned," she said, and handed him a length of twine, and turned back to the garden, and he followed her. Inside the house, in the kitchen, Mrs. Dallow was teaching William to read the kitchen accounts. Josephine was arranging lavender in a jar on the windowsill with the seriousness of an artist. Clara was asleep on the settle by the fire, her dark hair spread across the cushion, one hand curled under her chin. The fires were lit. The larder was stocked. The room smelled of beeswax and bread and the particular warmth of a house that is inhabited not merely by people, but by care. Wymere Hall had been empty when the Duke left his bride there in November. It had been the kind of empty that goes deeper than rooms, the empty of a life unlived, of a house no one had ever truly loved, of a man who had arranged his existence so that nothing and no one could reach the parts of him that still, beneath all the armor, ached for something real. He had expected to come back to the same emptiness. He had been wrong about that too. He had come back, instead, to the home he had not known he needed. And he had found it, tended and warm and quietly extraordinary, in the hands of the woman he had thought too fragile to survive. She had not merely survived. She had built him something worth returning to. And now, at last, he was going to stay. And that, dear listeners, is where we leave them. In a Somerset garden, in June sunlight, the Duke learning to bundle lavender while the woman he underestimated shows him, gently and without triumph, how to be present in a life worth living. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like and share it. Your support helps bring more stories like this one to listeners just like you, all over the world. Leave a comment and tell us, whose journey moved you more, Cecily's quiet strength or Alistair's long overdue return? Subscribe and stay close. There are many more tales of love, resilience, and the homes we build from unexpected places waiting just ahead. Until next time, take good care.